Hello, listener. Welcome to Juniverse Cheating Stories. Please subscribe for more videos.
It started so quietly, like a whisper in the dark, so subtle that Elena could almost convince herself it wasn't real. It began with a fleeting glance, a momentary connection of eyes that seemed to last just a bit too long. At first, she told herself it was nothing. She was overthinking, of course. A mother's mind wanders, doesn't it? But as days turned into weeks, the glances didn't disappear. Instead, they grew bolder, more intense, and harder to ignore. It was as though they were drawn to her, latching onto her every movement like a secret no one could say aloud. Her son, Daniel, had returned home unexpectedly after dropping out of college. He didn't tell her much about why, just that things weren't working out and he needed time. But something about him was different. He wasn't the same boy she had sent off to school. There was a heaviness about him now, an air of discomfort that filled the space around him. The boy who once shared his small victories with her, who laughed at her silly attempts to cheer him up, had retreated into himself. He barely spoke, his once expressive eyes now clouded with something dark. And then there were the eyes. Those eyes that seemed to follow her everywhere. Whether it was while she cooked dinner, folded laundry, or even sat at her desk in the study, she could feel them, watching. Not the innocent, loving gaze of a child admiring his mother, but something else. Something that made her skin crawl and her heart race, even though she told herself it was nothing. Elena had spent years in a marriage to Mark, one that had withered away like a vine with no sunlight. Mark, an ambitious architect, had once made her feel like the center of his world. But time, work, and indifference had eroded that love. Their dinners became silent, their conversations brief and strained. He was always busy, always distracted, always looking past her. Elena had tried everything, cooking his favorite meals, changing the way she dressed, anything to get him to see her again. But she had long ago faded into the background of his life. And when Mark left, it didn't hit her like a wrecking ball. No, it was more like a dull ache, a quiet acceptance that had settled deep within her. There was no anger, no tears, just emptiness. And now, Daniel, the one constant in her life, was looking at her in a way that made her feel alive again. It was wrong, wasn't it? A mother should never feel this way. But Elena couldn't deny the warmth it brought her, the feeling of being seen, noticed, in a way she hadn't been in years. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was someone worth looking at. Daniel was no longer the carefree teenager she had waved goodbye to years ago. The boy who used to tell her everything, share his hopes, dreams, and frustrations, had turned into a ghost in their home. Now, he spent his days holed up in his room, his door closed with an unspoken barrier between them. When he did emerge, it was always with a distant expression, his mind seemingly miles away. The boy she had raised was slipping through her fingers, and in his place was a stranger, brooding, quiet, and if Elena was being honest, almost angry. Elena tried, again and again, to break through the wall he had built. She'd bring him his favorite snack, try to initiate a conversation, but it was always met with silence or a cold, evasive answer. He rarely looked her in the eye, and when he did, there was something unsettling in his gaze. It wasn't the innocent admiration a mother might expect from her son. It was something darker, something that sent a shiver down her spine. It was as if he could see into her, see something she had buried deep inside herself, something she didn't want anyone, especially not him, to uncover. Her mind often drifted back to the last few years of her marriage with Mark. She could still remember the time when his gaze had once been filled with love and longing, when his touch was tender and caring. But that had all faded. Elena had spent so much time trying to hold everything together, trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, that she lost sight of herself. The woman she had been before marriage, before motherhood, was gone. Now, she was just a shell, someone who existed to fulfill others' needs. And when Mark left, it wasn't a dramatic exit. It wasn't a moment of rage or a battle fought with words. It was a quiet departure, a gentle slipping away that left her feeling like an afterthought. But Daniel's presence, even in his silence, was different. He didn't look at her like a mother who had failed or a wife who was invisible. He looked at her like he saw her, truly saw her. And Elena couldn't help but feel a strange warmth flood her chest, a warmth that both comforted and terrified her. She should have put up boundaries. She should have told him to stop. But she didn't. Because deep down, she liked it. She liked being seen, being noticed. Even if it was wrong. The more Daniel withdrew, the more Elena found herself wanting him closer. She could feel the weight of his gaze even when he wasn't near her. It was as though he was always there, watching, waiting, and with every glance, every fleeting touch, she could feel herself slipping deeper into a feeling she couldn't control, something that frightened her, something that both excited and revolted her. But how could she stop it? How could she stop wanting to be wanted after so many years of feeling invisible? It happened so quietly, so unexpectedly, that Elena didn't even hear the door creak open. She was lost in her thoughts, stirring a pot on the stove, the rhythmic motion of her cooking providing some sense of normalcy in a world that was anything but. But then, she felt it. A presence. Behind her, too close, too still. Her pulse quickened, a tremor running through her as if she had been caught doing something she shouldn't. When she turned, there he was. Daniel. His face was only inches away, his dark eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that stole her breath. The world around her seemed to stop, her heart skipped a beat. And the air grew thick with an unspeakable tension. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His gaze said it all. Elena should have stepped back. She should have taken a step away, told him to leave the room. But she didn't. Instead, she froze. There, in that moment, she understood something she had been denying for so long. She was no longer just a mother to him. She was something else. Something he saw not with the eyes of a son, but through the eyes of a man whose desires should never have been directed at her. The realization hit her like a cold slap. A rush of fear, guilt, and something darker. Elena knew she should have stopped him. She should have pulled away, set boundaries. But instead, she stood there, trapped in a web of emotions she couldn't unravel. It was no longer about a mother's love. It was about a line that had been crossed, one she couldn't uncross. And in her heart, as much as she hated herself for it, she didn't want to stop it. Not really. That night, Elena came home late after a long shift. Her body ached, her mind foggy with exhaustion. But as she stepped inside the door, a strange heaviness filled the air. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that pressed down on her chest and made her feel like she was suffocating. It wasn't the comforting quiet she had grown accustomed to. This felt different. Wrong. She moved toward her room, the familiar path feeling unfamiliar in the thick, oppressive silence. But then, she heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. Her heart pounded. It was coming from behind her door. It wasn't the noise she had expected, certainly not the kind of sound that would have made her feel this way. The sound was soft, almost intimate, and it sent a chill down her spine. With trembling hands, Elena opened the door. She froze. There, sitting on his bed, was Daniel. He was staring at the floor, his body tense, his fists clenched in a silent battle. When he finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, Elena saw something she never expected to see: desperation, pain, and something more. Something that shouldn't have been there. "I don't know what's wrong with me," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. "I know it's wrong. I know, but I can't stop thinking about you." Her breath caught. The words felt like a slap. A betrayal that tore through her mind, leaving her speechless. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something. Anything. To stop this madness, to make him understand how wrong it was. But no words came. She stood there, paralyzed, her world spinning, unable to form a single sound. And instead of pushing him away, instead of telling him to leave, she stayed. She stayed and listened as the unthinkable confession hung between them, filling the space with an unbearable weight. She wanted to wake up from this nightmare, to deny that this was really happening. But deep down, Elena knew she was trapped in something far worse than a nightmare. It was real, and it was only just beginning. Days blurred together as Elena drifted through a fog of guilt, desire, and confusion. The house was no longer a home. It was a cage, one that she couldn't escape. Daniel's presence lingered, his eyes always watching, following her every move. A silent plea etched in his gaze. He was never far from her. He would stand in doorways, lean against walls, his eyes locked on her like a predator watching its prey. Every time their paths crossed, it was like an electric shock ran through her, a mixture of dread and something far darker. There was no escaping it. Every time their skin brushed by accident, whether in the kitchen or when he lingered too long near her, it felt like a crack was opening up beneath her feet, threatening to swallow her whole. One evening, Elena sat in the living room, pretending to watch TV, trying to ignore the unease that hung in the air. She heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching, and she knew it was him before he even entered the room. Daniel stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. There was no escape now. She could feel the tension building, the silence between them thick and suffocating. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. But it cut through her like a blade. "Mom." Elena didn't respond. She couldn't. She wanted to stand up, to run away from the situation, to scream and tell him to stop. But she couldn't move. She couldn't make herself do anything. She just sat there, her chest tightening, her breath shallow as his gaze never left her. The air between them felt charged, like something was about to explode. Daniel took a step closer, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was light, hesitant, as if he were testing a boundary that should never have been crossed. But Elena didn't pull away. She stayed. She let him. The air between them crackled with an unspoken desire, an intimacy that shouldn't have existed. He sat down next to her, close enough that their bodies almost touched. Elena's heart raced, her body trembling with fear and something else, something that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. She knew, deep down, this wasn't just a moment of weakness. This was the point of no return. Neither of them could turn back. They had crossed a line that would never be uncrossed. And as they sat there, frozen, neither willing to break the silence, Elena realized they were both trapped in a web of their own making, and neither knew how to escape. The morning after the night that had changed everything, Elena lay in bed, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind restless, tormented by what had transpired. The silence of the house felt deafening, like the walls were closing in around her, pressing against her chest. Her heart raced with a mixture of fear and shame, a constant reminder of the line she had crossed, one that could never be undone. She had always believed that some boundaries were sacred, untouchable, had been irrevocably altered. What had once been a mother's unconditional love for her son was now tainted by something darker, something forbidden, a truth that neither of them could deny. It was there, in every room they passed through, in every moment they shared. The truth hung like a cloud, darkening their every interaction. Elena tried to avoid him. She would tell herself it was for his own good, that she needed space to clear her head, to make sense of the chaos that had enveloped them. But deep down, she knew the real reason. She couldn't look at him without feeling the pull of the temptation that had once been so easy to ignore. The desire that had been awakened in her was a dangerous, uncontrollable force, and every time their eyes met, it was as if she were teetering on the edge of something she couldn't control. She would make excuses, pretend to be busy, retreat to her room, avoid the kitchen where he liked to linger, but every time they crossed paths, that awful truth was there, staring them both in the face. There was no escaping it. Replaced by a fractured reality neither of them knew how to navigate. And that thought, the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again, terrified Elena. The life she had built, the role she had played as a mother, a wife, even a woman, had all been upended in one single, irreversible moment. Her identity had been fractured, and there was no longer any certainty. What would this do to her? She had been unable to stop herself before, and now, the consequences of her choices loomed over her like a shadow, threatening to consume them both.